Good. Hello, I am Mark Rosekind, a board member with the National Transportation Safety Board. The NTSB launched a GO team from Washington, D.C. We arrived yesterday afternoon to investigate the railroad accident that occurred in Brentwood, Arkansas. The NTSB is an independent federal agency. We are charged by Congress to investigate all civil aviation accidents, as well as significant accidents in highway, marine, pipeline, and rail. Once we determine the probable cause, we then issue safety recommendations. The intent is to prevent these kinds of accidents from happening in the future. Before I go any further, on behalf of all the men and women at the NTSB, I want to extend our best wishes for a speedy recovery to all those who were injured in this accident. I also want to introduce the new investigator in charge, Jim Southworth. He is an investigator with over 32 years of rail experience. I'm going to go over some factual information. This is a short line, Class 3 railroad. There's 140 miles of a north-south route, not a loop, which was what was reported yesterday. The maximum speed is 35 miles per hour. It is owned and operated by the Arkansas and Missouri Railroad Company. Their operations involve 90% freight and about 5% tourism. A passenger train which had one engine and 4 cars, and today was determined that all of the passengers were in the last 2 cars. The train stalled, a rescue train was called, and then collided head-on with the passenger train in clear weather. Both trains derailed. There was no fire and no fuel leak. The accident occurred at 10:25 a.m. Central Daylight Time, as opposed to the information yesterday, which we had as 10:51. So determined by the event recorders, 10:25 a.m. Central Daylight Time. Any information about injuries will be reported by the Washington County Department of Emergency Management. So none of that information actually comes from us. You'll need to contact them about any information related to injuries. Today there was an organizational meeting. There are 2 parties that have been identified as part of this investigation. They are the Arkansas and Missouri Railroad Company, as well as the Federal Railroad Administration, or FRA. I'm about to go over the information we learned today. There's quite a bit, but let me emphasize, we've only been here barely 24 hours. I'm going to be describing 1 day's worth of information we have, but there is quite a bit. I also want to emphasize this is all preliminary factual information. So, our Human Performance and Operations group has been working closely together. They had 2 interviews today. The first was with the passenger train conductor. That conductor reported that the train had stalled previously during the trip and then came to the stall and full stop, and once that was realized, then the passenger train was on the phone through cell phones, basically communicating with the railroad's operations center. And I specifically highlight the cell phones because the radios are known to be unreliable in certain areas, so these are actually company-issued cell phones to make sure that they can have conversations with the ops center. The dispatcher was also interviewed. The dispatcher had a normal workload at the time of the accident. That included operating 5 other trains, maintenance of way work, as well as other track inspections. Again, a normal workload for this individual. The dispatcher reported that the dispatcher informed the rescue train that the track was out of service. What that means is that the rescue train would be operating under restricted speed. What that means is restricted speed translates to 20 miles per hour plus the ability to stop within half the distance of any obstruction. So the dispatcher reports that the rescue train was informed the track was out of service, which means restricted speed, as I just defined. Next, there are many more interviews for them to conduct. That includes one this evening, which will be the train engineer from the passenger train. Mechanical, last night they allowed the equipment to move, and that process is continuing throughout the day. So starting last evening, equipment, track was being repaired. That's going to take a while. The equipment was moved to facilities for examination. That examination, which is in process, includes air brakes, passenger cars, locomotives, complete mechanical inspection, including horn, lights, etc. These are historic cars from the 1920s. Locomotives are from the 1960s. We are getting all of the maintenance documentation. So that's a critical piece of information that's been requested, and all of that is being gathered. One of the things learned today is at the time of the collision, the passenger cars were separated from the locomotive, from the engine. What that means is automatically emergency brakes came on that stops the passenger cars from going anywhere else. There were event recorders on both train engines, as well as forward-facing video cameras. The data has been obtained from the event recorders as well as the video recorders. The video recordings have been examined to determine that the data is sound and are now being sent to DC for analysis in our research and engineering laboratories. Separately, the event recorders had an initial review, and that review indicates that the rescue train struck the passenger train at 25 miles per hour. Next, there's a very detailed plan that's been being put into place to replicate the situation that occurred in the accident. This means at the same time of day, with similar equipment, on the track, to safely as possible try and replicate the situation so that we can look at all the different variables that appear to have occurred in the accident. Let me emphasize one more time, this is all preliminary factual information. Again, we're only in the first day, barely at the first 24 hours of the investigation. The NTSB mission is not just to determine what happened in the accident, but the why. That why is what allows us to issue safety recommendations so that these kinds of accidents can be prevented in the future. And I want to emphasize that if we find anything at all at any time, the NTSB can issue urgent safety recommendations. So we do not have to wait until the end of an investigation and a final report to issue recommendations. If we find something that needs to be addressed now, we can issue urgent safety recommendations. We will not be determining the probable cause while we're on scene. We won't be speculating on the probable cause, and we won't be providing any analysis of the factual information that we are providing now and in the future. The investigation really is just beginning. Our investigators believe that they will be on scene 5 to 7 days collecting information. And while this will be our last on-scene press briefing, there will be more information coming out of Washington, D.C. That includes that as soon as our investigators leave the scene, within 10 business days, a preliminary report will be issued out of D.C. with the information that we have. Let me just give you a sense of the process from here. Factual information is being collected, and then in Washington, there will be analysis of all that data. And then there will be a report generated that identifies the findings, the probable cause, and the safety recommendations from this accident. That process can take up to 12 months. If you want to follow us, you want to go to our website, ntsb.gov. You can follow us on Twitter, @NTSB. And our public affairs officer is Eric Weiss. He will be a point of contact for any other further public affairs information. So I will take some questions.
Elaborate on the repercussions that people could be facing from this.
So the question is, what repercussions could people be facing in this situation? So why that's actually very important is the NTSB's focus is on the safety investigation. So we're not looking at blame, liability, and one of the things I always like to emphasize is we're focused on issuing recommendations so these don't happen again. The FRA is the ones who creates regulations, enforces them, et cetera. So it would not be up to us to determine what subsequent action might be, but the FRA or Department of Transportation or someone else would be looking at those issues.
I know you said you couldn't elaborate too much on the specific cause, but I know we've been told that the leaves may have stopped up the tracks. Kind of elaborate on how that works, or tell us more about that.
So the question has to do with previous reports of how the leaves were part of the stall, of why the train stalled. So I was on scene today. It was great, and because our investigators were very thorough in showing me what's called black rail. And part of that actually comes from the oil that's in the leaves, and it gets on the track. So that's just one of several factors that could cause a stall. And so what's really important is to know that, yes, this was a fall foliage tour. Is that an issue there? Absolutely, our investigators are going to need to look at that, but there are a variety of factors that could have caused the stall that we have to look at. Hence, not just the track, but the operations and mechanical things as well.
Yes, sir. Do you know, I'm not sure if this is a question that you'd be able to answer, who will be responsible for these passengers' medical bills?
So the question's about who's responsible for the passengers' medical bills, and the NTSB is focused on the safety part. That's probably a question that needs to go to the company or maybe the Federal Railroad Association Administration.
Was there GPS on both trains?
So the question is whether there was GPS on both trains or not. Do we know?
That's something we're still looking at now within the cell phones as well.
So we're still looking at that, and thanks for actually raising that, because I comment on the fact that the communication between the trains and the operations center was by cell phone. So we're going to be collecting all the cell phone information. We'll determine if GPS was being used or not, because clearly one of the things we're going to want to do is collect all of that electronic data and see what kind of digital portrait we can actually get of literally the moments before the accident. Nowadays, that's a critical piece of information for us.
Do they have a system to where, I guess, another person, in this case the engineer on the opposite train, can see from a distance to stop something like this? I'm just wondering, that's why GPS is huge, so the proximity of each other. I'm just wondering, did he not see the actual train? And is there a system in place for them to be able to see the opposite train?
So the question has to do with how much the rescue train engineer would be able to see prior to the accident. That's very important for us. That's part of a very thorough plan to do this replication of the situation. There's a bit of a grade coming for the passenger train. There's also a curve that the rescue train was coming around as well. So part of what will happen in the replication of the situation at the same time of day is to look at exactly those issues, which are how far could the train engineer see in that sort of clear weather, because I will repeat that they should have been operating under 20 miles per hour and be able to stop half the distance to the obstruction. We have to get that factual information to actually know what those distances were. That data is being collected as we speak.
But you did say 25 miles per hour is what the rescue train was traveling before it hit the passenger train, so it was 5 miles over that.
So the question is, the rescue train was at 25 while restricted speed is 20. That's correct.
Okay.
There's a great, and that's why I always like to emphasize, those are the facts at this moment. And the difference is we're not analyzing them to say what caused this at all, but yes, those are the facts. Restricted speed is 20 miles per hour plus being able to stop at half the distance to an obstruction, but the rescue train from the event recorder was going at 25, which, by the way, we will still need to validate from a more thorough review of the event recorders.
So would that be considered, I guess, speeding, because you mentioned that the tracks, the dispatch told them that the tracks were off, if you will, that's why they needed to go down to 20 instead of the 35, so this would be considered a speeding offense, correct?
So what we would consider is that they should have been operating at 20 miles per hour plus being able to stop in half the distance to an obstruction. What the event recorder tells us is they were traveling at 25 miles per hour. What that means is part of what will happen in our analysis thoroughly. And let me say again, we have to validate the actual speeds. So, there's been questions about communication. That's one of the things we have to look at. We know what the dispatcher said. We have to understand what the engineer, what information they have, et cetera. And then, again, we have initial review of the event recorder. We got to go make sure that 25 is actually 25.
And you guys
Let me just go over here if I can, because there was.
You said he hit at 25, so do you know, had he engaged the brakes? Was he slowing down and still hit at 25, or was it just, he was moving at 25 when he stopped?
So the question has to do with the speed prior to the actual striking of the passenger train. And we do have initial information that the rescue train engineer was braking prior from a speed of about 28 miles per hour.
You mentioned that this was when the impact happened, that was as a consequence of a second stall? Were there did the passenger train stall twice? And if so, do we know anything about the nature of those stalls in terms of, was it track condition or engine or mechanical conditions on the train itself?
Right, so we actually have two questions there. One is how many times did the train stall? At this point, all we know is that the conductor on the passenger train actually reported stalling more than just the final one when being struck. That there was a previous time they stalled. Whether there were more than that, we're still collecting that information, but it does tell us this wasn't the only time in this trip. There was another time. And what the cause of those, the previous stall as well as this one, that's very much what we're looking at right now. So we already had a question about black rail, the leaves, et cetera. There are a variety of factors in your question. Could be mechanical, could be the track, traction, et cetera. Those are the things we're collecting information on. We'll be going after to determine the stall.
Have you been able to determine the distance between the two stalls? 100 yards, a mile, or?
So the question is, can we determine the distance between the two stalls? What's important about that question is it was just in our interview with the train conductor today that we learned about the previous stall. So we have to take that information now, go back and determine where there are other stalls that occurred, and then yes, what those distances were to get back to, was it the rail, was it mechanical, what was going on there prior to the stall that stopped them when the accident occurred.
Last question?
Speaking of communication, is there a standard operating procedure between the rescue train and the train in need? Are those two engineers in communication in any way? Are they able to relate information to one another about their exact location? Or is there any sort of, I understand there's no two-way radio service. That's why they had cell phones. Sometimes cell phones lose signal. Were they able to communicate when this happened?
So that question, which had multiple parts, I'm going to put into sort of one, which was really the channels of communication that were available and were they being used. Those are all very important questions because we're actually interested in the use of the cell phones, the communication between each of the trains and the operations center, and if there was any communication between the trains as well, including the specifics of the communications that were provided. So again, we know what the dispatcher reported what was said. We need to understand what the engineer actually knew about, and that interview is still coming. That one's not even scheduled yet, but it's in process. So what you were raising basically is a very good example of the thoroughness of what we have to go after. It's not just were they talking, but we have multiple communications, train to train, each train to opera, as well as the content of that information to see what was communicated and exactly whether or not people knew what they needed about the stall and the rescue train specific information about what it was going to do. Okay? Thanks very much.